Hi everybody! Today's video is on platinum pens. Soraya and I are going to be talking to everybody about the third big Japanese fountain pen company, Platinum. We've already done videos on Sailor, and we did a video on the Pilot Custom 74 line comparison. And so today's video, we're going to be focusing on Platinum gold nib pens. So that is the 3776 Century lineup of pens. They come in a lot of different colors and finishes, and most of them feature that same 14 karat gold nib, which we'll be expanding upon today. So today's video, we're going to be talking about these pens, and then later on I will be doing a deep dive on some of the nib comparisons and line comparisons for each of the nibs. So going into a little history about Platinum Century 3776 pens, the name 3776 Century actually comes from the height of Mount Fuji. Exactly. So the height of Mount Fuji is 3,776. 3,776 meters. So that is where the name of the pen comes from. Now, the pen was actually first released in 1978 as the Platinum 3776. But nearing the 100th anniversary of Platinum in 2011, that's when they released the special Century 3776, which was sort of more of a modern take of the pen, sleeker and supposed to be more for like the contemporary person, fountain pen user. So that is the lineup of the fountain pens that we'll be talking about today, the 3776 Century fountain pens. So, Soraya, do you want to talk to us a little bit about what these pens look like?
Yeah, definitely. So these fountain pens are cigar shaped, which I guess you can say is a very typical classic fountain pen look. And yeah, they have a nice sort of, I guess, I wouldn't say weighted, but they have a very nice shape in your hand. It's a good grip. It's not too thin. It's not too thick. And my favorite part are the details on the nib, because of course, as Daisy was mentioning, Mount Fuji has a special significance in this pen lineup. And on the nib, you actually see the peak of Mount Fuji, which is really beautiful. And then the breather hole of the nib is actually in the shape of a heart. A heart. So two really beautiful little details on the nib that it's sometimes people don't realize, but those little details are nice to notice when you're writing with the fountain pen.
Yeah, the heart is very adorable.
The heart is super cute. Yeah. And then another thing is the shape of the nib, right? It's a very, I guess, flat. That's vertical shape. Yeah. And do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So the reason we're kind of talking about this after talking about Sailor and Pilot is that often when you are considering your first gold nib pen, if you're looking at Japanese pens, this is going to be one of the three models that you're considering. So it makes sense to compare those three. So Platinum's nib and the shape of the nib, the flatness of the nib, is actually one of the most special features of the nib, and definitely something that it stood out to me immediately when we first added Platinum. I think it was like last summer, and when I was first writing with a Platinum pen, it really, really struck me that this nib shape was quite different. So most other fountain pen nibs, including Pilot and including Sailor, they have a curved top. They have a curved nib, and Platinum's top of the nib is very, very flat. And what this allows you to do when you're writing is kind of feel a little bit of bounce when you're writing, but not in a way that typically when you think of a bouncy nib, you're thinking of a flex nib and you're thinking of tines coming apart. And that is not what you get here at all, actually, because the top of the nib is so flat. When you're bouncing and when you're applying a little bit of pressure, it bounces with you, but there's no tine separation at all because of how flat it's engineered. And what that means really when you're writing is that it gives you very good line control when you're writing. So there's very little line variation between, like, on each nib, if you're using the extra fine nib or the fine nib or any of the nibs really, no matter how much pressure you're applying and like what angle you're writing from. Because of the flatness of the nib, it is a very consistent line width. So that's one thing that's pretty special about platinum nibs that I think makes platinum nibs and pens stand out.
Definitely. Another awesome, really, really cool and unique thing to platinum fountain pens is something called a slip
and seal. There's a lot of S words.
I'm sorry. I almost said slip and slide. That is not what it is.
No.
Slip and seal mechanism. And I guess the best way to show it would be on one of the clear fountain pens, so the same one that I picked up earlier. So basically, it's a spring-loaded mechanism at the top of the cap, and what it does is it allows that when you close your fountain pen, it creates an airtight seal. So Platinum's idea behind this slip and seal mechanism is that it prevents your fountain pen ink from drying out. So they almost guarantee up to about a year of your fountain pen ink being inside of your fountain pen without drying out. And we'll do a close-up of this, but basically when you put your pen in, as you're twisting the cap, the spring, you can see it tightening and sort of creating like that vacuum that allows the fountain pen ink to remain ink and not dried.
Yeah, that's very cool, and I think that's another aspect of platinum pens that really stands out. And the up to a year without drying out is really pretty incredible. Cool. And what's also incredible is that the feature, the slip and seal mechanism feature, is even available. Like, we're talking about their gold nib pens today, but it's even available on their least expensive fountain pen, the Platinum Preppy, which is like the most entry-level fountain pen. So
that's really cool that once they figured this out, they applied it to everything.
I know.
That's very nice. Thank you, Platinum.
I think that's great. And I think it's a big reason why a lot of people are reluctant to get into fountain pens in the first place, is that you think there's maintenance and there's upkeep. If it dries out, you have to wash it out. Your pen might be ruined, but this kind of softens that blow and helps you enter into the world of fountain pens with a little more ease, you know?
It's like a little hug from Platinum.
Yeah, thanks, Platinum.
Thank you.
So I guess a little bit more about the nibs, which we did mention before. The nib range that's available in the Platinum 3776 Century lineup of pens is also a little bit unique. They actually start their nib range with an ultra extra fine nib, and that is really, really a fine nib pen.
Ultra extra fine.
And we'll show everyone how fine that is later on in the line comparison. You can see. After that, it's pretty standard. After the ultra extra fine, it's the extra fine, the soft fine, the medium, the broad, the coarse, and then they also have a music nib, which isn't available on every single one of their pens, but it's available in certain bodies. So we'll talk about the bodies. I guess it's a good time. So the 14 karat nib Century 3776 pen is pretty much the same nib that's found on all of their, like, many different bodies and finishes of pens, going from their Nice series, which, sorry, do you want to talk about?
I would like to, yes.
I love
pronouncing
pronouncing the names
of these pens.
Yeah, also I can't.
Oh my gosh. So basically the idea behind this series, or the design of the Nice pens, is in the name, is that they were inspired by the waters and the architecture of Nice, France. Nice, France is a beautiful place, and they were very inspired by that location. So each of the pens feature a very French name. And basically, just quickly to talk about the body of this series, is that the process by which it's made, they sort of sandblast it, so it has a very it's a very interesting texture, also because of the ridges, but it's a very like matte, translucent. It's really pretty, and it has these sort of, I guess, windows or ridges that you can feel when you're holding the pen. And their idea behind that is that they like, while you're writing, for the light to reflect off of these ridges. It's super pretty. And this one is the Nice Pure.
Well done.
Thank you. The Nice Lavande. And then the Nice Lila.
Wow, you're so good.
Yes, thank you so much. My pride and joy.
I just can't. Lila.
But they're so pretty, and I think, you know, the names are they do the beautiful location and the inspiration justice.
Right, for sure.
Oh, we have a North American exclusive over here.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the Carnelian Red pen. It's a North American exclusive, and it's a red transparent body with rhodium trim and sort of shimmer, glittery detail shining through the pen. And that's also available in all the 7 nibs, or the 8 nibs, including the music one. Colors such as black gold, and they have colors like chartreuse blue, which is like a transparent blue, with some with gold trim and some with rhodium trim. I really, really like the laurel green one. I feel like that's no surprise. I feel like everyone knows that I like green at this point.
Yes.
And I really, really like green and gold. Like, again, everyone knows this about me already, but I really like this one. It just, it's such a classic color combination. It reminds me of the library lamps, you know? Yeah, so I really like this, and it's also a transparent forest green kind of look that I love.
And then my favorite is the celluloid series, so 3776 celluloid. And celluloid is super cool because, well, for many reasons, but just a quick backstory, I guess, on celluloid. It came out, or the process that they were creating it with was around the late 1800s. And celluloid is essentially like a type of plastic resin. It's very reminiscent of resin when you're looking at it, but the process by which they make these pens makes it extra special. It's not just resin. Celluloid starts out as a gel that is heated to very high temperatures, which allows it to be softened, and then of course as it cools it gets hardened. But basically celluloid, every pen is laid out into a mold and sort of created individually, and it takes a month, like months long curing time. And celluloid is a great material because it's shatterproof, waterproof, and comically the actual material of celluloid is very flammable, which doesn't affect your pens, but in the factory the reason that celluloid is not so much a very common material nowadays is because of that. But it makes it very special, and I really think it gives that very like classic fountain pen look. Like this is something you can imagine, you know, in your grandfather's desk. It's just very, it's very beautiful, very vintage looking,
and vintage feeling.
Vintage feeling, yeah. When you hold it, there's a certain like firmness to it. I don't know. It's very. It feels very strong.
It feels different from your resin pens a little bit. It's definitely a smoother surface. People describe it as like a very like solid feeling. Material. Yeah,
and then I think my favorite of the celluloid series would be the koi pen. You know, it's in honor of, or it's inspired by the very beautiful tradition of keeping koi fish ponds.
It's so well made,
and it really like each of these little flakes, you can see it's like red, cream, white. They're laid individually. So this is a pen that was made for you, and it really looks like koi fish swimming in a pond.
Yeah, it really, really, really does. Like, I don't know, I always wonder, like, do they come up with the name of the pen first, or do they come up with the pen and then name it koi? Whatever way it was, like, it's very spot on. That pen is koi. Like, if you look at it one time, that's exactly what you'll think of.
Same with the tortoise too.
Yeah, I really like the tortoise. Well, I don't know if it looks, is that supposed to look like a tortoise? I think.
Well, that material, like whenever someone makes, like, I think I have sunglasses that are like made
I was gonna say, I really just like
pattern.
I like that classic pattern of tortoise.
Tortoise.
I think I have sunglasses that are
yeah.
It's just like a very classic look, and I've always liked it, and I just think this pen screams like very vintage, fancy, high end, and it just looks very, very nice.
And there's layers within it. But no matter where you're looking on the pen, there's something new and beautiful to find.
And last but not least, the 3776 Century 14K nibs that are found on all of these pens are also found on the yearly special edition pens that are released from Platinum. And sadly, these lovely pens, we don't have any to show you guys, but they are absolutely beautiful, and they're released every year by Platinum. They're special edition, limited edition, and for the most part, I think they're all clear bodies, transparent bodies, with these really, really beautiful, stunning facets, and they're like inset resin body that really, really kind of like how when you rotate the Nice series, you can kind of see the light reflecting off the different facets of the body. When you rotate these pens, they have many, many more insets. So it really reflects the light, and it's almost like crystal like. They come in clear, and the one this year is fiery red and inspired by Mount Fuji. It's like the fifth in the series that's inspired by Mount Fuji, and the previous ones have also been inspired by some different scenic landscape of Japan. So shout out to Platinum. If you guys are watching, we would love to be able to get some of these pens, but they're not available to us just yet. Whenever they are, we will definitely scoop them up and have them on the website available for everyone to browse. And I'd love to see one in person as well. So that's kind of the last pen that we wanted to talk about today, where these nibs are found on this special body as well. But it's the same platinum nib, 14 karat gold nib, that's found on all of these bodies. And stick around for our line comparison, where we'll go into depth and show the widths of each line. So first off, in the platinum 3776 century nib lineup is the ultra extra fine, and this is one that is pretty like special. It is most fountain pen companies, they will make an extra fine nib and then a fine nib, and Platinum has this one that's even finer. It's the ultra extra fine, so it says UEF on the nib. And this one is really, really fine for anybody who loves to write very small characters. This is like a great pen, and it's definitely just a bit more feedbacky. It goes with the territory of an extra fine nib, I think. So that's to be expected. So I will say that it really matters which paper you're using when you write with this ultra extra fine nib. For example, this we're using today, Tomoe River paper, which is really smooth, so it brings out, it kind of like dulls down the feedback of the nib. But if I was using another paper that was a little toothier, it would feel, it might border on scratchy. So I'm gonna do some uppercase letters. And this nib, like, is pretty standard with other Platinum 3776 Century Gold nibs, in that it is pretty stiff to write with, and since this is an ultra extra fine nib, there's really very little line variation or anything like that to be expected. But that's not really what you're going for if you're getting an ultra extra fine nib anyway. XYZ. Okay, now we're gonna do this just to show the wetness. I'm gonna run my finger across it. You can see there's very little smearage even on the Tomoe River paper, which does take quite some time to dry because you're getting such little ink out with each stroke because it's such a fine pen. It's not a very wet writer at all, so it doesn't smear. So this is one good aspect if you are considering between a finer pen or a broader pen. The fine pens won't smear as much. Okay, so now I'm gonna do my line, and that is such a fine line. And in these videos, we always compare this line with a line that is produced by our felt tip Copic multi-liner pens. And I don't think they come in set sizes. They go from 0.03 to the largest size that we're going to utilize is the 1.0. But I don't know if I've ever had to use the 0.03, and I think today we're going to be using, I chose this comparison, this line to be approximately the same. It comes really close to the 0.05, and I'll show everyone here. So this is with like no pressure at all on the felt tip either. And those are really, really good approximations of one another, I would say. So this ultra extra fine platinum nib really comes close to a 0.05 millimeter Copic line. And that is quite fine. I think that's the finest we've ever had to go for one of these line comparisons. Okay, so next up in the Platinum Century 3776 nib lineup is the extra fine. So this is where like most fountain pen nib ranges will start. I would say like for Sailor, it starts with extra fine. For Pilot, it starts with extra fine. It's just that for Platinum, they had this one extra, ultra extra fine. So here we go. This is the extra fine. Whoops. That's not an X. Extra fine. EF. Okay. And this is really a fine pen, but going from the ultra extra fine to the extra fine, I think now I'm like feeling, oh, this is smooth and this is wet, but it's just all relative, I guess. My hands are like shaky. I guess maybe caffeine. These figure eights are a little challenging this morning. Okay, so we're gonna do some letter writing. Okay, and there's a little bit of a difference between the ultra extra fine that I'm seeing and the extra fine, but really not too much of a difference. Okay, and then just a show of wetness. I'm gonna just do that. And we're gonna run our finger across it. And you can see, comparing the ultra extra fine smear test and the extra fine, you definitely get a little bit more ink and smearing on the extra fine, and that totally makes sense. It goes with the territory. You're going up a nib size, so you're going to see a little more smearing, but it's not too much. And this is on a very smeary paper, Tomoe River. And the ink we're using today is Pilot Namiki Black. Okay, so now I'm going to draw my line. Okay, and so I think by looking at it, I don't know if you can tell, you might be able to tell that there is a slight difference between the extra fine line over here and the ultra extra fine line over here. The extra fine line definitely looks darker to me. So we assign this actually a 0.1 millimeter thickness, which is up from the 0.5 of the ultra extra fine. This is a 0.1 millimeter. See? Okay. So after the extra fine, it's a pretty standard progression here. The next nib size up from the extra fine would be the fine. Struggling with these figure eights today. Okay, that'll have to do. And we're going to write some letters for handwriting. And some lowercase. Okay. And now for our smear test. Okay, definitely a longer line here than the ultra extra fine for sure, but pretty comparable to the extra fine. And I think if you just look at the writing sample from the extra fine nib and just look down at the fine nib, these two actually come pretty close together. So they're very similar. And platinum nibs are, I think compared to, like relatively speaking, they are pretty firm. There's not much bounce or springiness to them. But I would say they're maybe a little softer than sailor nibs, which are very firm. Okay, so for this line, for the fine, I chose a 0.3 millimeter. There. So that is a 0.3 millimeter line. After the fine nib, we have the soft fine nib in the Platinum 3776 Century nib lineup, and that's this one here. And unlike the other Platinum nibs, the soft fine nib actually does give you a little bit of line variation because it's soft and it has a little more bounce to it. So you can apply just a minimal amount of pressure for a wider line, and I'll show you. So this is the soft fine. Soft fine. SF is what is engraved on the nib. Okay. So those are figure eights with very minimal pressure, and this writing is also with very minimal pressure. And now I'm gonna draw some figure eights with just a little bit of pressure, which is what you can do with this nib. You can see it has a little bit of bounce to it. It's just ever so slightly soft. Okay, so you can see the comparison between the no pressure writing here and a little bit of pressure over there. You get wider lines and wetter ink flow for sure, and a little bit more line variation. Okay. I'm going to do my ABCs. And this again is with no pressure because you're not really supposed to be applying constant pressure, even though this is a soft nib. With this pen, it's not meant to be used, it's not meant to be written with as if it's a flex nib. Okay, and for the smear test, I'm going to do one with a light touch, just like this. And it's not wet at all with a very light touch. And then I'm going to do one right next to it with a little bit of a firmer writing pressure. And it is a little wetter. You can see there's less smearing here, which means there's less ink that's getting let out when you're just applying the lightest pressure, versus over here, the nib is responsive to just the lightest bit of pressure, and it does let out more ink. And that's kind of, you can see that in the degree to which the smearing happens there too. Okay. So for the line test, or the line comparison, I'm also going to be doing 2 lines, since this soft fine can achieve different line thicknesses. I'll do one with the lightest touch, and then right below it with just a little more pressure. Not too much. And you can definitely see there's a difference between those 2 lines right next to each other. Now for this line, that is approximately a 0.1 thickness. Whoops, this is a 1.0. I always get those two mixed up. Okay, so let's go find the 0.1 Copic multi-liner. That's right. There. And we'll write over here 0.1 millimeter versus with a slight pressure, that is actually about a 0.5. Right? I think those come pretty close. Okay. All right. So we have the soft fine with a little bit of line variation. With the lightest touch, it is about the same as a 0.1 pen, which is actually what we assign the extra fine pen. So the soft fine, if you're interested in normal writing with an extra fine nib, but sometimes you want to go for a more expressive line that can bring you up to a 0.5 thickness, this might be a good option for you because it does give you some variation when you're writing. So after the soft fine in the platinum nib lineup, we have the medium. M. Okay. And we're definitely seeing the differences start to be a little more pronounced between the nib sizes. I think the ultra extra fine to the extra fine is very minute, but the difference is primarily in the feeling when you're writing. And then the extra fine to the fine is also very slim difference. It's like the difference between 0.1 and 0.3 lines. So that's very minimal. But the medium is where we really start to see the line change up a little bit, going up a nib size. Okay, so the smear test for the medium is actually, I would say, this wetness is about the same as the writing with pressure on the soft fine wetness. But the line is definitely, the line for the medium is definitely much thicker. So here's our line. And for this medium line, I chose that same 0.5 Copic multiliner line. Okay, so moving on, I think we need to start a new sheet of paper here. So after the medium nib, we have the platinum broad nib, and I think everyone will see the broad nib. The medium nib is really when the nibs start looking different, and then there's a pretty big difference between even the medium and the broad nib. The broad nib is really quite a wider line. B. This is really broad and quite a wet writer. So if you have any inks that are particularly shading or sheening, this broad would really show those off very beautifully, whereas the ultra extra fine and even the extra fine and the fine, those might not do them the justice. So it's just something to think about also when you're picking your nibs. Okay. Now for our smear test, I expect that this one is going to be a lot wetter. Yeah. So, it's going to take a lot longer for these strokes to dry, just because you're letting out so much more ink when you're writing. Okay, so now for our line. That's the broad line, and I chose, it's kind of between a 0.5 and a 1.0, which are the two Copic markers that we have available. They don't have all the sizes, but you'll see here, this is the 0.5 that we chose for the medium, that matched the medium nib. and it is a little bit thinner, this 0.5, than the broad line. So I'm going to say it is greater than a 0.5, maybe approximately a 0.7 millimeter. That's what I'll say. All right, next up is a fun one. This is the Platinum Coarse nib. So this is kind of like Platinum's double broad nib, but you'll remember if you all watched the Pilot comparison video, Pilot actually has a broad, a double broad, and then a coarse. So their coarse is like a triple broad almost, and this kind of takes place of the double broad, but actually it is such a jump from the broad that I would say it's almost like a triple broad. You'll see. So this is the coarse. You'll see that's, oh my gosh, it's almost like too thick for my handwriting. I think you can't really make out my words. And I have to write much bigger with this pen, obviously. But it's very smooth. Very smooth to write with. And I'm scared of what's going to happen in the smear test. It's just going to keep going. I feel like it's just going to keep on smearing. And there's very little variation with this nib, even if you're writing with a light pressure or greater pressure. This is kind of like your thickness. So if you don't like to write in very thick lines, if you don't have very big handwriting, or if your notebooks all come with like a tiny grid, this pen might drive you crazy. But it's kind of fun, just as for somebody like me who writes with a fine pen, typically something more on the finer side. It's kind of fun to write with something like this because it's just so smooth, and it's like so inky. Wow, that's a long trail of smear going up from the broad to the coarse. You can see really there's a big difference between the boldness of those characters. Okay, so now for the line. Okay, so 1.0 is as thick as it gets for these Copic multi-liners. So 1.0 is what I'm going to use. That's the 0.1. 1.0. But we'll probably have to add a few millimeters onto that because this is such a thick line. So let's see, 1.0. Yeah, so this is the 1.0, and you can see that the coarse nib line is a lot thicker visually than the 1.0. So see, this is 1.0, and this has to be greater than 1.0. So let's say it's 1.3 approximately millimeters, because it is definitely thicker. Last up in the Platinum 3776 Century nib lineup is the music nib. And this nib is actually, it has 3 tines, and it is made for writing music notes, as I've mentioned before in some of our other line comparison videos. Music, MU. And this nib is supposed to have some line variation between your horizontal strokes, your up-down strokes, and your cross strokes. Now, this music nib on the platinum line is not available in every single one of their Century 3776 pens. So we were doing most of our writing before in this video with the Chinonsino, I think that's how you say it, I don't know, white, and this is actually the black gold because it's not available in all of the different models. But it is, I think the platinum music nib is probably the broadest of all of the music nibs that that I've tried. It's really incredible how much ink is coming out of this thing when I write with it. It's very smooth, and a lot of comparisons I've mentioned before are made between the music nibs and stub nibs. But I'll say that the platinum music nib is the least like a stub nib than other stub nibs. And it's interesting. It has line variation in that you can create these thick downstrokes with your nib perfectly articulated on the paper like that. And if you wanted to do cross strokes like that, it has thinner cross strokes. So you'll see thicker and thinner. But you can even create even thinner cross strokes by holding your pen at an upright angle. So if you wanted to make even thinner cross strokes, you could do that. So thick and thinner. You can really see the difference between those two. Okay. And this, like I was saying, is really an impressively wet nib. It's almost like, I don't know, the dry time on this would probably be a minute or something. It's really, really wet. And we'll do a little smear test here and it'll just go for days. Yeah. So that is the music nib smear test. And you can see like all of my writing there essentially didn't dry at all when I ran my finger across it later. So it all smeared into just one big block of ink. Similar to the Coarse nib, but definitely there's a longer smear due to there just being a lot more ink getting let out. So, yeah, so a lot of comparisons are made between music nibs and stub nibs because it kind of imparts this calligraphic character onto your writing. But I think that out of all of the other music nibs that I've tested, this one is the broadest for sure, and it has the least line variation, I would say. It mainly has these thick strokes. Even on a cross stroke, it's pretty thick unless you were to really turn your pen up, and even then it's not that much thinner. So it's kind of a fun nib to write with. It's a lot of fun, very juicy. But if you're looking for something that'll give your handwriting that calligraphic touch, I don't know, you might want to try some other ones before committing to this one, in my opinion. There's our line comparisons for the 7 Platinum Century 3776 nibs. We started with the Ultra Extra Fine, which is a very, very fine pen with approximately a 0.5 thickness. And then we worked our way up to the extra fine and the fine, which I think the ultra extra fine, the extra fine, and the fine are all really quite close. They're separated by like 0.01 or like 0.1 millimeters. So the difference between that, I will say, is really just that you're getting a lot more feedback with the ultra extra fine, a little less with the extra fine, and less with the fine. The soft fine is interesting in that you can achieve some different line widths. There's a little bit of bounce to the nib, so you can get a line width that is every day, sort of like an extra fine, but on special occasion or when you're feeling extra special, you can add some flourish to your writing, like we did here, and have some thick lines added in with your thin lines to create some more expressive strokes for script or for calligraphy, but it's not a flex nib. The medium nib is definitely a step up from the fine and the soft fine. And then after that, we have the broad nib, which is a significant jump up from the medium nib, with more wetness, a thicker line, and then the coarse nib, which is really, really, I feel like there's almost a nib size missing between the broad and the coarse because it's such a jump. It's such a jump from the broad. So it's really, really wet, very thick line, approximately 1.3 millimeters compared to the Copic multiliner. And lastly, the special nib, the music nib, which doesn't come on every pen in the Platinum Century 3776 lineup, which is often compared to calligraphy, is probably the wettest of all the nibs in the Century 3776 lineup. Definitely a very wet writer, the broadest music nib that I have tried to date. A lot of fun to write with, but I'm not sure it gives your writing as much expression as some of the other music nibs out there. So now that we did the line comparisons and the writing samples of all the nibs, we're just going to do a roundup of all of just the lines that you can get from these pens and this nib range. So starting with the ultra extra fine, we're going to do the extra fine, the fine, the soft fine 1, soft fine 2. I'll give you guys 2 lines for that to show you the difference between little pressure and no pressure. The medium after that, the broad, the coarse, and the music 1 and the music 2, again to show the difference between the 2 different line widths that you can get for your music nib. Okay, so there you have it. Just the line comparisons between the 8 platinum nibs, going from the ultra extra fine to the extra fine, the fine. We have 2 lines for the soft fine to show the little bit of line variation that you can get between the 2. or between on the one nib, going from writing with no pressure at all to writing with some pressure over here, the medium nib, the broad nib, the coarse nib, two lines for the music nib, one very thick horizontal stroke, and the thin cross stroke. Um, the thick vertical stroke and the thin cross stroke. Um, and you can definitely actually see here, this illustrates that there is a consistent, like sometimes slight, but there's definitely an increase in between each nib size that you're going up. And the broadest one is probably the music. The broadest line that you'll be able to write out of these platinum nibs is the music. But that is not the only thing that it does. It also gives you just a little bit of line variation as well. It creates this thick line and a slightly thinner line for music writing, but also for expressive writing.
Thank you so much for watching our platinum fountain pen video. We hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about these pens and watching Daisy's line and nib comparison.
Let us know which one, now that we've done all three, Pilot, Sailor, and Platinum, let us know which one you decide on.